Coming back for session 5. Welcome back. We've had some very intense discussions in session 4, and we're about to start session 5. The topic is Sustainable Development and Transformation in Borderlands. Moderator is Sang-Min Nam, Deputy Head of UNESCAP Sub-Regional Office for East and Northeast Asia. And we have 6 presenters for session 5. Let me introduce them to you. Fred Cocozelli, Associate Professor and Department Chair, Government and Politics, St. John's University, New York. Andrea Zinzani, Research Fellow, Department of History and Cultures, University of Bologna, Italy. Laura Hemmond, Professor of Development Studies, SOAS, University of London. We also have Paul Nugent, Professor of Comparative African History, University of Edinburgh, Scotland. And from Korea, we have Young-Ju Lee, Attorney at Law with Sun Pro Bono Center. And lastly, we have Chung-Ho Han, the Director of Kangwon Center for Creative Economy and Innovation, Korea. Welcome, everyone. Okay, I'll hand over the mic to you, to the moderator, Sang-Min Nam. Whenever you're ready, please.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. Our distinguished speakers and also viewers, other participants. Welcome to the session on sustainable development and transformation in Borderlands. As you know, this conference is organized by UNRISD and People for Earth and supported by Gangwon Provincial Government and Cheonan County. I'm very pleased to moderate this session, which is joined by excellent speakers, experts. So we have speakers from UK, US, and Italy, and also certainly from Korea. And they are going to present their insight, information, and our experiences from Africa, Central Asia, and certainly from Korean Peninsula. But before, I'm not sure, before moving on into the session, I may need to also make an announcement, housekeeping announcement. So this session will be recorded and live streamed via the YouTube channel. And you can find the recordings of past sessions there in case you have missed. And then also you will see we have enabled the comments section on the YouTube channel. Please use the comments section for any questions you have. And you can address a question to one speaker or multiple speakers if you wish. Also, you can share your comments in the section. And at the very end of the session, we will also share a link with a very concise, it's only 3-question survey. So we would be grateful if you could fill out the brief survey. So without further ado, let me move on to first presentation. Professor Fred Cocozelli, who will be speaking about social citizenship across borders. Our MC already introduced Professor Fred Cocozelli, and in addition to his current academic background, he also worked as a humanitarian field officer in post-conflict Kosovo. So, which means he has a hands-on experience in conflict zone. Let me invite Professor Fred Cocozelli for your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the organizers and to the hosts. I wish I could be there in person. This would be a fabulous opportunity to do this, but I think it's fabulous that we've managed to put together such a conference with all the technology available, and we're sort of all here. So thanks again. I'll go ahead and share my screen with the slides, and and talk a bit about social policy across borders. All right. I said, so my presentation on social citizenship across borders said I'm from St. John's University in New York, in New York City. Okay, so where I'll start with is how democratic citizenship and social rights interact at different levels of border integration. And to be direct, right, I'm fairly new to border studies, although I, as moderator noted, I worked in the Balkans, in particular Kosovo, which is in some ways inherently a border place. And so it's a little bit of a new area of research for me, but it's proven to be exceptionally interesting. So ultimately what I'm looking at is how democratic citizenship and social rights, right, are derived from most often clearly defined polities, right? Generally, we think of these as nation states, but generally from these defined polities. And what I've found in the start of this research is the idea that integrated borders and borderlands actually present very systemic challenges to the very definitions of polities, right? Because they operate in this particular zone. So to think about social policy and social citizenship generally, and this is where more of my background is, right? Is focused on the rights and obligations of members of a polity, right, citizens, as they generally pertain to their social well-being. In terms of policy, we generally think about pensions, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, social protection more broadly spoken of, things like healthcare and education. And these have been sort of the traditional areas in which we've looked at social citizenship and social policy. Bob Deacon, who did a tremendous amount in terms of expanding how we think about social policy, pushed the idea to expand this beyond institutions, particularly as we look at international and transnational questions of social policy, to allow for more attention to sort of general policies of redistribution and regulation. And this allows for attention to the relationship more broadly to the topic at hand, which is development, right? And the ways in which development interacts with social citizenship. It opens up a variety of sectors and areas of scholarly attention: agricultural, environmental policy, trade policy, social welfare oriented analysis then becomes available as we sort of look at these, if we start to think about them as extensions of social policy. In general, tying social policy to citizenship is implying this broader relationship between citizenship and what citizenship tends to mean. And fortunately or unfortunately, or, you know, it's just sort of a fact of practice, national citizenship has been the overriding practice of how we think about citizenship in general, right? It's generally been bounded by nation states, and social policy in particular has also had a very similar boundary, right? In a sense, border, in that, you know, pensions and disability assistance and all of these sorts of practices, as well as Deacon's broader sense of regulations and redistributions, have tended to sort of end at the border. There's a functional limitation to this, right? Social welfare institutions tend to need a definition of space and a definition of membership in order to sort of be able to function and decide the kind of redistributionary mechanisms. And likewise, regulations have often needed some point to end, right? And so not temporally, but physically, we have these sorts of boundaries inherently marked in, and citizenship has sort of reflected that. Of course, we live now in a much more transnational and globalized world, and there's been much greater attention over the years to the ideas of transnational citizenship and citizenship that sort of crosses borders. We've tended, I think, a lot of the literature on this to look at issues such as immigration, international institutions, and transnational civil society as sort of the places where we look at this. And one thing that this has tended to do is mostly open it up to a more global vision, right? And the dynamic has mostly been about things like transnational mobilization, how you get workers or civil society or different elements of society activated politically across borders, but not necessarily at the point of the border. And likewise, a lot of the research has been on citizenship rights abroad. How do you vote abroad? How do you get access to your pension, or in the United States, your Social Security when abroad? And what are the impacts of that in terms of transfers of funds? But when we look at Borderlands, there's a different aspect to this, I would argue, right? One that focuses on the geophysical space, the fact that Borderlands, like the nation state project, implies a limited idea of space. The borderlands are themselves defined. And in this case, the limits of this area are the space that surrounds the limits in some ways, right? It surrounds the border. And so you have this not very clearly defined, right? Because it's hard to know exactly when borderlands end at the interiors, but a general sense that there are places that we can speak of specifically. And so what that means is that the geophysical delimitation of borderlands necessarily implies an overlap, right? These are defined spaces, but they're defined in the sense in which they overlap multiple spaces, right? And the multiple spaces in this case being the nation states, usually 2, sometimes 3 or more, but the sense that you've got a defined space like the nation space. So this presents a different kind of conception of transnational, right? It's no longer strictly global or even regional, right? But delimited to a particular space. And that makes for some particular aspects, I think, for development that are different, right? And the two that really seem to come out, I think, are the fact of the border as present, right? That there is, in fact, something which defines the space, and what defines the space is that it's the meeting of these other limitations. And then the institutional dynamic that surrounds this, right? That interacts here. So looking at it, and I don't think Sohn was the first one to sort of argue this, but I think he does presents it nicely. Looking at the border itself as a resource for this particular space, I think he argues there's a couple of particular aspects of this that come out as really useful. One is the idea that the border delimitates the bounded space. It shows you where the ends of the adjacent polities are, right? And it's an active separation, right? It's the delimitation, and then it's enforced in some way. But it also provides an interface, a way to go across these, right? So there's this sort of these first three sort of distinct ways in which you delimitate the way you achieve an active separation from one to the other, and then come back and interface. The border also provides this point of differentiation, right, which can be economic, it can be social, it can be all of these sorts of different aspects, but it does tend to matter, right? If your differentiation is for wages or housing prices or geographic space or the kinds of space, then that kind of differentiation across the border is going to matter, and it's going to allow for a variety of different kinds of interactions. And then the border itself acts as an affirmation of identities, or even identities, right? I should probably have the plural on the slide, in the sense that it affirms those on one side or the other of the border, and it affirms the identity of those who are in the border, who are in these borderlands, and tend to think of themselves as having this particular sort of borderland-based identity. So to think about borders and institutions from this, right? National institutions, including those of social policy, which reinforce social citizenship, have tended to end at the borders, right? And if they go further, it's by some particular transnational institutional arrangement, right? And so these institutions, although they can, if they do cross borders, it has to be with some sort of agreement, some sort of practice in place, particularly if they're dealing with the defined polity of the borderland. Informal institutions can operate, I think, a bit more freely across the border. You know, if we're thinking about institutions like families who are often on both sides of the border, right? Or community groups or religious groups that often find themselves on one or the other side, but are not necessarily part of the state. So Wroblewski provides a somewhat useful, I think, schematic to start to think about the levels of integration, right? And you know, he's very explicit, right? He takes this from Stigblad and Lackinger, and he's very explicit that this is really you know, a small slice of the different kinds of interactions, right? So you've got, you know, AA, where you've got fairly strong borders, right? AB, where one side has more integration to the other, and then when you can consider sort of BB, where you've got sort of stronger levels of integration. This is very much just sort of a picture painted of the ways in which we can sort of conceptualize. And I think when I was first approached about participating in the conference, one of the things that really jumped out was the many ways in which we have to think about borders. That you could think about it, these sorts of, as Wroblewski puts it, the strong borders, the more integrated, right, from one side to the other, but also these points of differentiation where, you know, A might represent a more developed or a stronger economy, whereas B might be a different economic space, right? And so you have lots of variation within these that then reflect the levels of integration. So Sohn takes this in a somewhat different direction and characterizes a couple of different ways of this. And one is this idea of a geoeconomic, right? And this is closer to that sort of AA, where you still have the state borders, and because of a sort of a geoeconomic vision of border integration. And there's, you know, there tends to be labor market, transnational production, cross-border consumption, housing markets sort of operating really with strong attention to differentiation. And there's, you know, interesting arguments about the ways in which this then develops, including not necessarily positive contributions across the borders, right? Where differentiations in housing markets can produce dispersal into hinterlands, you know, that then produce extended commute times, right, as well as sort of ineffective use or inefficient use of space, right? His other characteristics of integration is this territorial project, right? The making of the border itself as a place, right? And this builds up a kind of hybridization of identity and community across the borders. It tends to be a more holistic vision of integration across borders, and has a potential for a deeper cross-border integration, right? A sort of relationship across the two. I think within this, and this points to work by Mauricio Ferrara, one particular aspect we want to think about with this is some of the risk inherent with cross-border integration in some ways. In one hand, it's tied very much to decentralization of states, right? Ways in which what had previously been strong states that delivered for social policy, for example, relatively strong social policy benefits, come up in some ways to their limits here. And as they're pushed towards decentralization, there's often benefits, but there can often be negative repercussions as well, reductions of payments, reductions of support as you move towards the argument that there's a differentiation in particular for a border or a need to sort of pull towards these spaces. And likewise, these can create, as Ferrer argues, a kind of negative competitive solidarities, right? Where people are building solidarities around the border itself, creating a kind of imbalance with hinterlands or interiors that then allow for more of this sort of competitive dynamic, right? And I think one of the things you see in particular looking at this is the ways in which different kinds of economic structures across borders contribute then to these kinds of different, and this really builds, I think, in terms of how DEEPEN thinks about social policy as regulatory and redistributional in many ways. By creating these sorts of open borderland spaces, you create competitive structures for wage deflation, for housing impacts, as I pointed out earlier, as well as potential ecological impacts where you don't necessarily have the control over the space as you're building these competitive stresses across the borders. And so you can find yourself with massive, truck parking spaces where you're lining up the trucks, which is effective for good use of trade, for example, where you can move things relatively quickly across the borders, but may not necessarily be reflective of good use of the actual natural resources in this space, right? And so to sort of conclude to this, right, as I say, coming to this field of borderland research, relatively new, I think one of the things that really jumps to me is the idea that it holds within it some really particular challenges. And I think we have to be very much attuned to the negative, I think what economists would sort of think about as the sort of negative externalities of cross-border integration, as much as the positives of bringing these places together. And I guess I'll leave it there. And we've got the sources from the research there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fred Kozelzelli. I'm not sure how to see the questions from participants. Can guide me how to see any questions and comments from? Well, let me move on to Professor Kozelzelli. Let me bring you one question to you.
Okay.
So you presented the various concepts and the different level of interaction and integration across borders. And there is concept you presented that this geo-economic dimension and different role of transnational or informal institutions that directly related to the defining citizenships. And so could you, now you are from New York, and there is during last 4 years, there is an issue around the border area between US and Mexico, where you have also seen the Brexit, and it's not really borderland, but can you bring some cases and then elaborate your concept, your idea?
Sure. And I think the borderland space in the United States with Mexico is in some ways a really interesting example, right? In that over the course of not just the past 4 years, but really since the major efforts at integration, right, starting from the 1990s and NAFTA and the idea of sort of building a more integrated space across the border, we had advances in terms of integration, but some of these involved what we can think of as very sort of exploitive constructions, right? And so the idea of an integrated border in terms of trade and economy can also mean dislocation from sort of interior, right? And this is the idea for sort of the idea within the United States of industrial jobs moving across border to pursue lower wage workers, right? And the creation of sort of this maquiladora sector of the economy. And this does in fact bring development at the border regions and can be effective in terms of building efficiencies over time, but it also then has some long-term implications in terms of the interiors of the state, right? And so for the United States, it's hard to dismiss the idea that one of the reasons that there's a bit of a, that there, it would be sort of polite, a bit of backlash against globalization, which results in a sort of, you know, nationalist populism, which proved to be electorally successful, you know, 4 years ago, and close to electorally successful just a couple of weeks ago, reflects, I think, some of the tensions that are there, right? And so in developing the borders, I think we also want to be attuned to how integrated borders are going to feed back into the politics of the hinterland, right? And create as much as possible an awareness of that these are very much, the integration goes both ways, right? The borders integrate across, but then they also back up to the interior, and that those politics need to be paid attention to as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a very interesting point. This cross-border integration can cause a negative impact on the economy inside the country. So
I think in the broad sense,
yeah,
it
broad
creates
sense.
positive
Yeah,
growth.
certainly.
But in particular ways, we have to be attention to where the shifts happen.
Thank you.
I think it's
Okay. Let me move on to next presenter, and then after all the presentations, we will also invite, we will have a more open Q&A session. Our next speaker is Professor Andrea Cinzani, who will be speaking on environmental policies, politics, and informality in the borderland. He will bring cases from Central Asia. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
So good morning. So first of all, I would like to thank Il Cheong and all the staff of the UN Era ISD for the invitation and for the organization of this very interesting conference. The title of my presentation is Environmental Policies, Community Politics and Informality in the Borderlands, the Political Ecology Perspective. And my contribution aims to reflect and analyze environmental policies and development processes interplays through the approach of political ecology. As I will discuss, political ecology represents today an interdisciplinary framework which critically analyzes society-environment intersections and in particular related power and conflicting dimensions. Empirically, I will briefly discuss the case of transboundary water governance in Central Asia by focusing on politics in the borderlands of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. My contribution is divided into three main parts. The first one briefly introduces the discussion on environment and development interplays by reflecting on global environmental governance and the international development perspective. Second one presents the framework of political ecology, and it's important to reflect on the social production of nature and the relevance of connecting science, policy development, and communities. While the third and the last part presents the Central Asian case and analyzes the policies and borderlands context. In the conclusion, I then will highlight some recommendations for more effective socio-environmental policies and approaches. So it is well known by both academics and policymakers how over the last 2 decades, the context of global environmental governance has been progressively shaping the global political agenda and related policies, from the notion of sustainable development to the conceptualization of the green growth to the last formalization of the Sustainable Development Goals. by focusing on environment and development interplays. Since the 90s, international development organizations such as the World Bank, the UN agencies, the Asian Development Bank, and the USAID, among others, have started to promote in the Global South, especially in post-socialist regions after 1991, the implementation of diverse environmental initiatives inspired by global policies, such as, for instance, the Agenda 21, the integrated water resource management with regard to water resources, the integrated coastal zone management focusing on coastal transformations, and in particular with regard to transboundary regions, the UNEC Water Convention. And with specific regard to neighboring states, these initiatives promote the interstate cooperation and conflict mitigation by providing, in general, environmental resource sharing and benefits for riparian states. However, these initiatives often focused and considered interstate relations, so as the international governance dimension, and ignored the local community scale and, in particular, the socio-environmental complexity of borderlands. Moreover, these policies were inspired by political visions and practices such as good governance, participation, capacity building, as well as by state withdrawal, privatization, and commodification of resources by promoting, in certain way, a neoliberal approach. This perspective somehow tended to depoliticize and naturalize environmental governance and related decision-making processes by often ignoring the knowledge, the experiences, and the practices of specific territories and related communities. And this is the case, in particular, also in the borderlands. Over the last 2 decades, environment and development interactions, in particular their controversies and contradictions, have been analyzed by the political ecology approach. Political ecology has emerged since the 80s thanks to the contribution of critical geography, anthropology, sociology, political economy, as well as of natural sciences. These disciplines share the intention to critically investigate relations between the global consolidation of capitalism and non-human nature, as well as the socio-political production of the environment. Today, so in 2020, political ecology aims to repoliticize the environment by reflecting on its socio-political dimensions and on power relations embedded in global environmental governance and related policies. In particular, political ecology approach seeks to investigate the role of institutions and actors involved in environmental governance, and specifically to reflect on the vision, interests, and related power relations and inequality among these actors. It is relevant to highlight that political ecology is the product not only of academic theoretical knowledge, but also of the experiences, the practices of civil society, social groups, socio-environmental movements, as well as of indigenous and marginalized communities. This interaction and the co-production of knowledge enable the understanding of the socio-environmental nature of specific territories, local resource management traditions, social claims, struggles, and main issues. And therefore, political ecology cannot be considered a pure discipline, but rather a research and political space oriented towards the advance of new progressive socio-environmental relations aimed to reconfigure state, society, communities interactions, mainly towards socio-environmental justice. And therefore, the approach of political ecology could be relevant for us to advance a reflexive and a critical debate on the complex socio-environmental nature of Borderlands, as well as on global environmental governance more in general, and on policies which have been promoted by development organizations, state agencies, and governments over the last 2 decades. Now I will introduce a research project I conducted in 2015, while I was working in Paris at the CNRS, which focused on international development and transboundary water governance relations in Central Asia, and specifically in the borderlands of the Talas River, which is shared by Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. With regard to my theoretical framework, I adopted the political ecology of development perspective, which seeks to analyze how the implementation of global water policies shapes, characterize, and change either social and power relation at the community level by paying specific attention to problems, issues, inequalities, and struggles. My research specifically focused on a development project which has been supported since 2006 by the UNEC, the OSCE, and the World Bank, which was aimed to establish a transboundary water commission named the Two Talas Commission. This development initiative was inspired by the United Nations Transboundary River Management Project and later by the UNEC Water Convention, and had the main goal, firstly, to strengthen interstate cooperation between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, secondly, to regulate water supply between the two countries, and thirdly, to improve infrastructures, operation, and maintenance. In parallel, since 2010, this initiative also aimed to establish a basin council in order to strengthen social inclusion, participation, and communities' capacity building and empowerment. Research from my side included 2 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Kazakh and Kyrgyz borderlands in order to understand the potential outcomes of global development initiatives in the borderlands' everyday life and politics. The evidence emerged from this case study. I think it's important to advance a reflection on environment and development interplays, and specifically on the complexity of borderlands. Indeed, so the efforts of the UNEC, the OSCE, and the World Bank gave an important contribution to strengthen interstate water cooperation at the national level between the two countries through the establishment of the Two Talas Commission. And so the commission was established in 2006. However, international organizations somehow did not consider uneven power relations among the two states, since Kazakhstan was able to impose the agenda on Kyrgyzstan, take advantage of cooperation, and also hamper some important initiatives, such as the formalization of a transboundary water council. But what is more important on the evidence is that the establishment of the Commission has not shaped borderlands either social relations. And we have to reflect on the fact that despite the international development discourse based on community inclusion and participation, I realized that local institutions were not included in decision-making processes. Some of them were even not aware of new interstate institutions, and members of communities were not consulted. The representatives state that claims on transboundary canals management, both to the Commission and state institutions, remained mostly unheard. And therefore, Borderlands community level relations, networks, and local institutions are very important. And indeed, the Talas Borderlands could be defined as a transboundary space of informal micropolitics, which emerged as a feedback mechanism towards exclusion and marginalization. Furthermore, I would state that informal micropolitics and socio-environmental experiences and practices are deeply interconnected with Borderlands communities' long-standing relations and traditions. And so the example of the Talas Borderlands enable us to advance our reflection on the socio-political and environmental complexities of Borderlands. Indeed, despite these territories are included in two different states and ruled by respective national and transcalar politics, we can state that borderlands are very often characterized, as also Fred highlighted, by deep informal socio-environmental networks, connections, and practices which deeply influence everyday life and politics. These relations, in some cases, are even most important than formal national and regional environmental governance mechanisms. And so in conclusion, I would state that although a deep understanding of local communities' knowledge and practices should be the imperative for the international development agenda, these processes are even more strategic in the Borderlands context. In my opinion, this is, and it will be in the next future, the most important challenge for development policies, and more in general for democratic and for environment and development interplays. Indeed, I would say that rather than advancing and promoting new top-down, more democratic and inclusive participatory mechanism, it is strategic to redemocratize environmental governance through a deeper understanding and consideration of communities' rooted knowledge and related grassroots practices and politics. This perspective will be strategic also to advance and deal with issues of socio-environmental injustice, both in borderlands and in other territories. And this will be the case if we reflect on what happened over the last couple of years, not only in the global south, but also in the global north, where in the last years claims and struggles to redemocratize and repoliticize environmental governance have been advanced by the civil society and different many groups and environmental movements. And therefore, I would state that the political ecology approach is relevant both for policymakers and academics. On the one hand, to critically reflect on the limitation and, in certain cases, unsustainability of environmental-oriented development initiatives, while on the other hand, to consider and advance novel progressive policies aimed towards the reconfiguration of socio-environmental relations oriented toward more sustainable and just futures. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Professor Cinciani. You have brought very interesting point, starting from the concept of a political economy, political ecology, which is not necessarily just based on academic exercise, but actual practices and even social movement and the experience of a cooperation, transboundary water cooperation between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and highlighting the limited role of a commission, but also the significant role of informal connections, informal politics, and also the importance of a community knowledge and practices and experiences, and how they can support further strengthening the concept of a political ecology and utilizing political ecology to advance the new progress in sustainable socio-economic development. Due to time concern, let's move on to next speaker, and then after all the presentations, we will have a Q&A. And I was just reminded by the organizer that to really control the time. So I would like to request the speakers to briefly, possibly speak within 15 minutes, not more than maybe 17, 18 minutes, so that we save some time for Q&A. Thank you. And our next speaker is Professor Laura Hammond, who is going to speak about the livelihoods and mobility in the borderland of Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak with you. I'm just going to share my screen here. And I'm going to take us now to the Horn of Africa, which the Horn of Africa we consider to be defined in different ways at different times. But in this sense, I'm including what is the member states of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. So in particular, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, Sudan, Eritrea. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about some research that is based on a few sort of different research exercises carried out in different border regions throughout the region. And I'll explain that a bit more in a minute. So just to preface my remarks, I should say that much of the work that I'm sort of thinking through with you today comes from a paper that I wrote from a volume that's just come out by the World Bank, published by the World Bank, called From Isolation to Integration, the Borderlands of the Horn of Africa. It also includes some really excellent in-depth kind of ethnographic case studies, as well as a kind of overview paper from Professor Jonathan Goodhand, my colleague at SOAS, who I think you heard from yesterday. So if you're interested further in reading more about this work, then I would refer you to that volume, which is, you can download it online. So as I said, I forgot to mention Djibouti, I think, in my list of the countries of the Horn of Africa. When we think of borderlands in these regions, they have a few different kinds of characteristics, and I will just mention them here. In many ways, what I try to do in this research is to think about borderlands as not the edges of governance systems or the edges of state control, and very much in the way that the first presenter spoke about a kind of nationalistic lens that sometimes obscures for us what happens at the borderlands. And similarly, following on from Andrea's presentation, I'm really very interested in what people do in their common everyday lives. And what are the ways in which we can think about border regions as really zones unto themselves that are not the edges of a state system, but because they live at the border and because people are exploiting the resources and then sometimes are limited by the resources that are afforded by the border, their livelihoods and their livelihood systems form unique and distinct kind of areas unto themselves. And I think that that's something that hasn't been looked at. And I'll explain that a bit more. But when we think about borderland economies, when we think about the kinds of activities and flows that are going on within these areas, we can see that there are very often zones of common livelihood practices. So you might, in the Horn of Africa, typically borderland zones, particularly in the eastern part of the region, tend to be very arid areas, heavily dominated by pastoralism or agropastoralism. There's not a very sort of generous resource base in terms of being able to support agriculture or other forms of activities. So it's a dry land, arid area, and that is, and pastoralism certainly plays an important role, but as we'll see in some of the maps that I'll show you in a few minutes, there are other forms of common practices as well for which the border features centrally, and which I'm talking about, of course, cross-border trade, both small petty trade as well as larger items, both legal and illegal. Some of it is documented and tax paying, some of it is not. And the governments, in fact, have been trying to work to regularize some of the small-scale petty trading that goes on so that it doesn't have to be part of the sort of illicit economy, but it can encourage small traders to still continue to work within the bounds of legality. It's also, of course, borderlands in most places anyway, and particularly in this region that I'm working on, is a place where social and political ties bind members together. You have ethnic groups with members living on both sides of a border. You have people moving back and forth to see their families, where families, in fact, are split between different sides of the border. So in many ways, and this is a common feature of many states that were carved up by colonialism, the borderland, for all intents and purposes, particularly in terms of social networks, can be rendered largely meaningless. In political terms, it can be extremely meaningful in the sense that people have a foot in two different states, and they do what you would expect them to do, which is to creatively manage the opportunities and to minimize the risks that are presented by that proximity to two different kinds of nationalities. When we think about borderland development, some of the goals of borderland development, and there have been many initiatives that have tried to promote borderlands in this region, aiming at building community resilience, enhancing security and stability. States are often concerned about poorly controlled borders, that they may be entry points for groups that would like to destabilize them. They're seen sometimes as gateways for irregular migration, and also as sites of conflict and displacement, in some cases localized, in some cases interstate. I'm also, in the work that I do, really interested in mobility and the ways in which mobility takes place in and around borders, both legal mobility, people getting visas moving through, and if that's what's required. In some cases it is. And in other cases, just the informal movement of pastoralists, of traders, of people coming, labor migrants looking to find seasonal labor migration in various places. But also we know that borderlands can be, of course they are, as I mentioned a minute ago, gateways for for migrants seeking to make further journeys. And sometimes they just pass through those borders and go on their way. And in some cases, they often get stuck at the borders for a variety of reasons relating to legality, relating to their ability to finance the journey, maybe falling afoul of the kind of exploitive behavior of smugglers and traffickers. So there you often find at borders in this region people who are kind of stuck there who originally came with the intention of going on somewhere else. And again, I want to sort of reiterate this idea that rather than being situated at the edges of governability and the rule of law, there are sort of rules and orders that exist within these border regions that are unique to themselves and that are worth understanding, investigating, studying, and in some cases protecting. I think sometimes borders are seen as places where there must be tighter, greater control, and less movement, less flow of goods, when in fact the opposite is what is sometimes needed. When we think about border resources in these kinds of resources in border areas, and this should be probably common to many others working in different regions, but it may be useful to divide those into 4 different kinds of categories. So without going into lots of details in the interest of time, I'll just mention them quickly. The economic resources that are available through the fact that there is a border and that the border has a hub of often commercial activity. but again, both legal and illegal, that people can take advantage of. But as well, sometimes there are natural resources that can be taken advantage of and monetized in various ways. Political resources refer to the different ways, I kind of mentioned it very briefly, the different ways in which people can access power and sort of recognition of rights from each of the states that are situated around a border. And they may sort of pick and choose or try to at least maximize what's available to them by presenting themselves on one day as a citizen of country X and the other as a citizen of country Y. Neither of those things is entirely wrong. Thinking about identity resources, the ways in which the border presents the people with the flexibility to present themselves in different ways, but also at a group level gives them legitimacy for making claims to land, to political power potentially, and other things. Identity resources can be quite important. And then finally, thinking about status and rights resources, which enable people to make claims to citizenship. Sometimes they also give them the ability to make claims to refugee status. So quite closely tied to political resources, but somehow also a little bit separate from them as well. I won't go through the details of this slide, but I wanted to show you on the map where some of the border areas that we've been working in are. I lead a large research consortium called the Research and Evidence Facility, which is funded by the EU Trust Fund for Africa. And we've been in existence since 2016. But early in 2016, we were asked, right as soon as we started up our work, basically, we were asked if we could do some feasibility and assessments of borderland areas in these 4 areas. So the Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea triangle, the Amhara, Sudan kind of connection, particularly if you know Ethiopia, around the town of Metema. And then in South Omo, which is a very culturally heterogeneous area that borders with Kenya, but is also very close to South Sudan. And then finally, what we call the Mandera Triangle between Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And what we were just looking at is sort of looking for opportunities where there were resources that might be benefit from being sort of developed in parallel. So you can have on border, when you think about border development, you could think about sort of parallel development such that services and opportunities are offered the same on both sides of a border, which has the benefit of not creating magnets by which people will run from one side to the other. And that's particularly the case often where the two countries are not particularly interested in having people do that crossing. So it's about trying to create a similarity of service and of quality of life on both sides. In some other cases, though, there have been examples where there have been true cross-border types of operations, and that particularly in the area of peace and security, where local administrators have been talking to their counterparts on the other side, trying to develop peace-building platforms or to resolve conflicts, to carry out joint kind of rule of law activities. And that's been quite successful in some ways. And so, going back to the theme of this conference, thinking about peace building, that may be one area that we can learn from. So I won't go through all the details of the slide, as I say, but what we did with this piece of research was to sort of feed into the formulation of what became a 63 million euro project being now implemented by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, as well as UNDP and some other organizations, to try to help develop and create opportunities in the border region. And that was kind of our entry into this area and thinking about what's the significance of border economies really in and of themselves. We then followed that up with some other research in 2018, looking at 3 border areas, the sort of area around between South Sudan and Uganda here. The area, I don't know why I've got this kind of mislabeled a bit. We have the area around South Sudan and Uganda and Kenya, so sort of triangle, as well as an area really between, this should be a little bit further over this, this circle, but it was really between Ethiopia and Sudan. And then finally over in the triangle between Somaliland, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And we were trying there to understand really how do these border economies function, how do they work, what are the ways in which people rely on each other across these different borders, and how might those efforts be supported. There is a large World Bank-led initiative called the Greater Horn of Africa Initiative, which is trying to get investment in border areas. And one of the things that we came up with, and just don't worry about the detail of this, but just more the colors really, and the two areas that I've highlighted. We saw that in each country had a sort of livelihood map. So each of these colors represents an area in which represents an economic activity that most people in that area rely on. So in this kind of sort of golden area, this gold represents pastoral activity, pastoralism, livestock, and livestock products, as well as a little bit of self-employment. And what was important was that this map didn't really exist before. We asked our friends at the Famine Early Warning System Network to create it for us. What you had was individual maps, one of Ethiopia, one of Somalia, one of Kenya, one of Uganda, and they hadn't all been stitched together. So you couldn't see the fact that this golden area of between where this arrow comes down between Somalia and Ethiopia is one livelihood zone that transects across that boundary. Similarly, if you look at the inset that I have here with northern Uganda and South Sudan, you have this little kind of green wiggly area where crop sales and labor are exceedingly important, as well as different forms of crop sales and labor, with a little bit of self-employment and livestock as well, the brown bits. Again, you can see that those areas are partly determined by the agroecology of what happens in that area, but it's also about what are the opportunities afforded by the boundary. So you can see that that green line in particular really follows the boundary in really important ways, and that's because the border is generating its own kind of economy. And these are dynamics that we wouldn't really have been able to see before if we had not put these maps together and really tried to understand borderland economies as areas unto themselves. So there are kind of interesting ways in which these things line up. Because this is the first time we did it, we have some anomalies as well. If you look, for instance, up in Sudan, along the northern Ethiopia border, which is now a site of refugee displacement, you have labor and crop sales on one side, and self-employment on the other. It's a bit about the different kind of languages and different terms that countries are using when they do their own national mapping system. So there's a lot more that could be done with this map, but it helps us to start to develop the idea of borderland economies in important ways. I'm going to just also, what we did with this research, and without going into lots of detail because of the interest of time, was really to try to understand how people make decisions about their own economic activity and ultimately about their mobility based on the resources that are available to them. So some of you may be familiar with the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, which talks about different kinds of assets that people use and they try to maximize them, they try to protect them during times of shock. And they use that to try to reach a sustainable livelihood in basic terms. This is a kind of modification of that thinking of the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, which is taken from some colleagues who in 2011 wrote a major report for the UK government for something called the Foresight Project. But it was looking at the ways in which people take environmental, political, demographic, economic, and social assets and think about whether or not movement is a good idea, or whether it's advisable for them, whether it's less risky or more risky to undertake movement. And so in the borderland studies that we've been doing, we've been taking the same schemata and trying to think about what do those different assets look like in a border region, and how might the decisions take into account the opportunities afforded by the border, and so that this flow chart or this process that's being mapped out here would look really different for people who live at the border than it would for people who live in the hinterland of the country. So, for instance, when you look at the factors that go into making a decision, We've included the cost of moving, including using smugglers or brokers, the links that people may have with diasporas, the messages they're receiving from them, the degree of legal freedom of movement and trade, or the inability of engaging in free movement and trade. Those kinds of factors come into people's decisions about whether to pass through a border area, whether to stay in it, and try to maximize what they can from the borderland economy. And so it's sort of a marrying of thinking about mobility and also thinking about borderland economies. So just to kind of wrap up in this way, I've just got a couple of more comments to say about the policy implications of this work. Because ultimately, we're thinking about how can you use this work in our sort of so-called clients, or the EU, or in some cases the World Bank, thinking about what can they do with this approach. So I think that if we take this seriously, this kind of orientation towards borderlands, it invites us to think about how to work together to harmonize different policies across borders between different countries, in some cases 2 or 3 in our cases, countries. Thinking about trade policies and regulations that affect traders. So an example of that has been that Ethiopia, for instance, knows that there's quite a lot of low-level petty trade that is crossing the border on a regular basis. Now, if you try to tax every single person who comes across the border with a sack of potatoes for the local market, it becomes impractical, unwieldy, and you'll thereby sort of force traders into an underground economy because they won't be able to fulfill the requirements for getting permits and paying taxes, et cetera. It's not worth it for them in commercial terms to do that. So there has been a move to try to regularize trade up to a certain level so that poor and small traders are not disadvantaged by their proximity to the border, and they can take advantage of it in that way. So that's a way in which policy has, through a better understanding of how people use the border, has adapted itself in that way. It also thinking about the ways in which social services are available. Clearly, if you've got a great hospital on one side of the border and not very good health service on the other side, you're going to have people crossing the border. But understanding what that network of demand is, if you have a hospital right on the border, understanding that your catchment area is going to come not just from the country in which the hospital is situated, but from other places, can help to provide better service, to make sure that that facility is well staffed. And in some cases, it might help to create linkages with health service providers on the other side of the border. In terms of conflict resolution and peace building, I already mentioned a few ways in which local leaders, whether they're local political leaders, local police personnel, local security forces, are working together to try to particularly to resolve low-level conflicts that exist between communities, to keep them from escalating. And that kind of work is really important. There's a lot of good work going on in that area. And finally, thinking about migration and border management, freedom of movement policies, there's also an understanding that, again, it becomes impractical to expect people to get visas and passports for every cross they make into the local area just to go to the market or to go to that local hospital. And so there have, in all of these border areas that we've been talking about, been efforts to try to relax the rules around free movement, particularly for people who live in those border areas and for nationals of the countries that are involved. Some of this, what all of this kind of leads to in more theoretical terms, is the idea that it's sort of a challenge to the idea that all mobility is problematic, that borders need to be closed or borders need to be strongly controlled, that migrants represent a breakdown of law and order or control. And we've seen that quite a lot in this COVID-19 pandemic as well, where at the first instance, all borders in the region were completely closed, and then was realized that that's not really practical, that borders must be open in order to facilitate the connections between communities, between individuals, and even between nations. So there's been a bit more opening, but there still is a problematic nature in which people who cross those borders on a regular basis are seen to represent some kind of a particular threat in terms of disease transmission that needs to be thought about in other ways. And finally, just to think about this idea of developing approaches towards supporting livelihood systems in a cross-border, more a way that really matches the nature and the shape of those livelihood zones that I showed, rather than trying to take a sort of methodologically nationalistic approach and really just think about livelihood support up to and stopping at the border. So I'll leave it there, and
Thank
let's
you.
do some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hammond. I mean, your point that Borderlands is not the age of government control or state system, but Borderlands as a center of this cross-border livelihood zone and how to further strengthen the existing potentials for the Borderlands. Thank you. And we have quite a number of questions already received. So in order to utilize those questions, we have to save us time from presentation. So let me move on to next speaker, Professor Paul Nugent, who will be speaking about the missing ingredients in African border. So it's I'm from University of Edinburgh. And so let me, I have some other points, but let me save time. So let me invite Professor Paul Nugent. Paul? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen. Can you see that? Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but we don't see your PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, right, hold on.
Perhaps it can organize, can secretariat to.
Yeah, I don't know if there's something I should have done with the settings.
So, Professor Nugent, the secretariat, the organizer will share the screen. Share the
Hold on, I think we might have a solution.
Okay, so you can just say next to move to the.
Right. So is that okay now?
Yeah, it's.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I must apologize because I'm in Ghana at the moment, actually looking at the impact of the continuing border closure in border areas, but I'm staying in a hotel where the Wi-Fi is not necessarily as good as it might be. So apologies if I start to break up at any point, just let me know. I think the thing I should start by saying is that having just listened to Laura Hammond, I think there's a lot of synergies, a lot of similarities between what she's been talking about and what I want to talk about. The difference would be that I'm dealing with a slightly more macro level, and when I'm, as it were, narrowing it down regionally, I'm talking a little bit more about West Africa. My starting point, is somebody going to advance my slides, or can I do it? Yeah. The starting point for my paper is that while Africa has experienced sustained economic growth, there hasn't really been a peace dividend, in the sense that if you look at conflict patterns, there was a decline using ACLED data. If we could proceed to the next slide. What's going on here? We don't seem to. Really stuck. According to the ACLED datasets, there was a modest decline in armed conflict in the first half of the new millennium.
Sorry, Paul, Professor Paul Nugent, are you controlling the PPT, or we are also losing you?
This has been reversed, and the pattern is actually one of the steady.
Can I ask you to turn off your PPT, and then let me ask the secretariat to put that
Okay, I'll turn my
on
one
the
off.
screen. So let me ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've turned my one off.
저기 사무국에서 이거.
So our secretariat will work on controlling the slides, please.
그래, secretariat is controlling the PPT. So 안 보이는데요. 다시 한번 그 스크린에.
But we cannot see that. Can someone put that on the screen, please?
So can you see it?
Okay, so secretariat is controlling the PPT, so you can just say next to move forward. 다음 페이지로 넘겨주세요.
Next, please.
Professor Nugent, so would you start from this slide?
Sorry. Okay. So could we move to the next slide? Okay, so that's sort of a graph showing you a rising pattern of violence after 2011. We can skip forward. Fundamental patterns, if you can take the next slide, is that while the overall level of conflict has actually been going up since 2015, the thing that's, so could we have the next slide? That's a sort of continental level, and if you can observe the main conflict crucibles, if you like, Great Lakes, parts of Horn, Lake Chad Basin, and West Africa, it's very clear that these are concentrated overwhelmingly in border zones. And if you sort of move into particular regions, the pattern is even more apparent. If we could have the next slide. So this is the border, this is conflict in the area, in the borderland area between Mali and Burkina Faso. So most of the incidents in recent times have actually been in the border zone. Similarly, if you go to the next slide, this is more recent data on the border between Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. So the conflict pattern, as it was, replicating itself now on another border. And if we can have the next slide. This is an unfolding story about an Islamist insurgency in the borderlands between Tanzania and Mozambique. And it's a very similar story. It's mostly happening on the Mozambique side, but actually it's also to some extent happening on the Tanzania side of the border as well. So there's a pattern here, and the question is why? What is it about borders that is conducive to conflict? Is it about the borders themselves? There is a truism to the effect that borders are at odds with the socio-cultural geography of the continent, but that doesn't really translate into conflict in a very direct sense. There are certainly disagreements between states about where their borders run, particularly in relation to bodies of water, lakes and the sea, but very few conflicts have actually led to substantial armed conflict, and where they have, this has tended to be in the Horn of Africa, notably in the Somalia-Ethiopia War of 1977-78 and the more recent Ethiopian-Eritrean War of 1998 and 2000. More typical is the dispute of the Bekasi Peninsula, which was resolved by Nigeria and Cameroon through a recourse to legal means. So there's not really conflict concerning states, and as far as secessionism is concerned, there are a number of secessionist movements, and in fact secessionism is on the rise. But this doesn't really translate very directly into patterns of armed conflict. And most of the conflicts that have occurred in recent times have not turned on the legitimacy of African borders. And in a curious way, one of the side effects of armed violence, that is the flight of refugees, has actually had the effect of reinscribing borders. So it's had the opposite effect. So it's not really about the borders per se. Yeah.
Professor Nugent, perhaps
yes.
Could you turn off your video? Maybe perhaps if we have just the audio, it might help.
You want to turn off my video?
Yeah, video. Yeah.
Okay. Is that
Yeah.
any better? Okay.
Let me see.
So the other possibility is that armed groups are simply attracted to border spaces. And one reason for this historically is that governments have tended to back rebel movements in neighboring states. So you have a sort of a regional cycle of conflict. But insurgencies have tended to thrive in regions that are disconnected in various ways. And indeed, rebel movements have actively sought to promote disconnectedness by targeting main roads, cutting off larger towns, and so on, making it possible to remove the last vestiges of state control without actually needing to govern territory in the conventional sense. So there's a very important spatial component here. Could I just have the next slide? I think it's important to note that while there is a perception that border regions are remote, actually a very large number of Africa's capital cities are located either on a border or within 50 kilometers of a border. So you actually have this very interesting phenomenon of urbanism, border urbanism, which I'm not going to go into here. But you do have the other type of border, of course, which is characterized often by sparsely populated drylands or forest zones where there's a very different kind of dynamic. And those are the places where conflict tends to play out. And this reflects some of the legacies of colonialism, notably the use of forest reserves to create buffer zones, road and rail networks, for example, that ran from economic enclaves to the coastal port. And that pattern pretty much replicated itself after independence. So rebels seek to make space in their own way, and a range of actors have been engaged in their own interventions that are intended to increase cross-border cooperation and or address conflict in border regions. Could we have the next slide, please? We can move through that one. Next one, please. Yeah, so here we come now to the three interventions that I wanted to briefly mention. The first is boundary demarcation and cross-border cooperation in relation to resource use, infrastructuring, and military security. And I'll say something very quickly about all of those. Can we move again to the next slide? So when it comes to boundary demarcation, there's been a particular concern within the African Union in particular, but also within some of the regional economic communities, to address the issue of borders that they think are not properly demarcated and are therefore recipes for conflict. And the idea here is that if there are valuable resources in border zones, this means that if you don't know where the border is, this is a potential source of future trouble. It's sometimes expressed in terms of the adage, strong fences make for friendly neighbors. And the African Union Border Programme, with the support of the GIZ, the German Development Agency, has been engaged in an exercise now for some time in re-demarcating all the borders of Africa. And this particular map is an early account of where they had got to at that point. When we move to the second aspect, which is infrastructuring, maybe we can have next slide. Here we have the African Union, regional economic communities, the development banks, and so on, committing substantial, in fact, unprecedented resources into infrastructural investments that are intended to defragment the continent and to maximize economic synergies within the sub-regions. This is one of the corridors, the northern corridor, running from Mombasa through Uganda down to Rwanda, and in theory up to South Sudan and into the Congo. What they have in common is that they are supposed to sort of integrate Africa's economies regionally, but also to bring Africa into a much better relationship with the rest of the world, and particularly the global economy. The link to conflict is very indirect, because the argument is that it's only through that you can improve livelihoods, increase well-being, and create the preconditions for peace within border areas. So it's not a very direct link. But if you take the next slide, there are some where, let's skip that one, so we're out of time. Can we go forward? Can we go forward? one case where you can clearly see a different spatial logic, or a very particular spatial logic taking place, is the LAPSET corridor running from Lamu into South Sudan in one direction and southern Ethiopia in the other, where in this case, the Kenya government was absolutely intent on seeing this project through, despite a lot of skepticism about its viability. And one reason was that the Kenya government was keen to, as it were, have a presence to secure the northern regions of Kenya, which were seen as prone to conflict and much else besides. So it was a kind of spatial intervention designed to increase the control of the state. The third one I identify is securitization. And again, I won't say too much about it. What we have is a greater attempt on the part of security organizations to share information and to work together in order to deal with insurgencies of various kinds. And a good example is in West Africa, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, or the Lake Chad area, the multinational Joint Lake Chad Basin Force, which again seeks to increase military cooperation, working on two sides of the border to deal with insurgencies. And in the case of the Boko Haram insurgency in the Lake Chad Basin, this has been relatively successful. What they all have in common is that they are essentially top-down initiatives designed to give governments greater degree of control over border regions. Now, they have a number of different blind spots, I would argue, and this is true in relation to each of them. If you take the emphasis on border demarcation, boundary demarcation, for example, the African Union Border Programme was initially supposed to be doing boundary demarcation alongside actively promoting cross-border cooperation, but that basically has dropped out of picture and it's been much more narrowly defined. The purely security approach.
So Professor Nugent, I'm wondering whether this is the right slides. Or should we move to next?
We can advance, like.
Yeah. So, organizer, can you please move the slide forward? Yeah. This one or move next?
Yeah. This is... So, there are some issues with those approaches, but the important point is really that they don't address the issue, which is that insurgencies breed in areas which are disconnected. And this is where the European Union example might be rather useful, because the Association of European Border Regions was established as a non-governmental alliance of people in border regions who, in a sense, managed to get their act together, come together, and in due course were able to apply for EU funding for projects in border regions, establishing better connectivity within those border regions without necessarily relying on central government. And the AEBR itself was asked to look at cross-border cooperation in West Africa and to come up with certain sort of lessons and what could be learned from a dialogue about African and European examples. And interestingly enough, they argued for something similar to what had happened in Europe, and in particular the formation of cross-border associations, which would provide a voice for municipalities, cross-border regional bodies of various kinds. And this approach has not actually really got very far, I think, and things have actually gone backwards in the sense that some of the, I think the next slide will show this, some of the, next one please. Yeah, okay, let's leave it with that one. Some of the cross-border regional initiatives that were taken in the early part of the 2000s have effectively now dried up partly because of the insurgencies themselves. So one of the cross-border initiatives was in the borderlands between Mali, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire. That is now an area, a conflict zone. So the kind of hopeful cases in West Africa have actually radically reduced over time. And even before COVID struck, if you take East Africa and West Africa, actually, we've been moving the opposite direction. Nigeria closed its borders well before COVID came along. In East Africa, Rwanda and Uganda closed their borders because of various disputes. In effect, taking two of the main corridors and blocking them, in effect. So we have a kind of regionalism which has been in retreat before COVID came along. The question then, drawing all of this to a close really, is what might be done to more actively promote cross-border cooperation from below within border regions. And I think what Laura has talked about in the IGAD region, I think is very interesting and instructive and has lessons for other regions of Africa. In the case of West Africa, there's an awful lot of work to do. The forces opposing greater regional integration and greater cross-border cooperation are actually rather formidable at the moment. For me, the most likely chance of going beyond the present impasse is the AU-EU partnership, in which there is talk of funding for initiatives that might be more conducive to reactivating the cross-border initiatives and supporting cross-border initiatives from below in the manner that the AEBR was advocating. But as I say, things in the last few years have actually been going in reverse gear, and it's going to take, I believe, a good couple of years before we get back to where we were before. So on that kind of gloomy note, I will almost end, but I'll try to end on a more positive note, which is the last slide, if we can move forward. This one, yeah. So one of the things I've been very interested in is what could be done to support cross-border initiatives which come from below. And border festivals are one such initiative. And this is an annual border festival that takes place on the border between Ghana and Togo. And we've been studying a number of cross-border festivals with a view to maybe putting these forward, showcasing them as examples of what can be done by supporting local initiatives rather than doing everything from above. So I'm conscious that we've run out of time, and I will stop on that point.
Thank you, Professor Nugent. Despite the technical problem, you have successfully managed your excellent presentation. Also, it's good to know the story. I mean, starting, you were highlighting the increasing violence, conflict in the border zone, but the trend and the potential of cross-border cooperation, especially economic corridors, and even the last one, is making a community across the border. Thank you. And then, so we have now two speakers from Korea. So from last 4 presentations, we have listened to the more conceptual part and transboundary embedded cooperation on international waters and economic corridor and economic integration. So, but when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, there is no such interaction. So it is a vacuum of any interaction across the border. So it might be very interesting for, I mean, all participants and speakers, you would have a knowledge of the border area between 2 Koreas, but this might be a very interesting presentation. And then for 2 Korean speakers, I wish to request you try to stay about 10 minutes. So that, thank you. But first, let me invite Ms. Lee Young-ju, who is a lawyer and who is also specialized in law related to North Korea. The floor is yours. Could you turn on your microphone? Yeah.
Yeah. 들리시나요? Can you hear me? 안녕하세요. 저는 사단법.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lee Young-ju from The Sun. So you're going to speak in Korean, right?
You know, the interpretation service is available. Please look at the menu at the bottom. So interpretation into English is available.
Can I go back to my presentation? Again, good evening. I'm Lee Young-ju from The Sun, from the Sun Pro Bono Center. One is the founding member of the Sun Pro Bono Center, and I'm also working for the One. And I participated in the conference last year as well. in last year's conference gave me an opportunity, and this year's conference is giving me this opportunity, and it's my honor to present this topic. And I prepared this presentation with Ms. Chung Eun-young. And this year's topic is peacemaking in Borderlands. And I'd like to talk about the DNG and its adjacent area, and specifically the issues for the development of the DNG and its adjacent areas. I will take a very legal perspective, a legal approach to this issue. I think you have heard a lot about what DNG, how DNG was created. It was created under the Korean Armistice Agreement. The Korean Armistice Agreement is the normal term, but if you look at the slide, the normal title, the official title is quite long. As the title says, the South Korean government was not the signatory of the agreement. According to the article of the Armistice Agreement, you can see that the DNG was defined. And the Korean Armistice Agreement defined the DNG, and it has been 70 years since the definition was made. And it's a very rare case around the world. So the DNG and its adjacent area did not give easy access to people. So it was the area that is very pristine, and natural resources have been preserved in the areas. And it has very meaningful in terms of the division of the two Koreas and from the ecological value perspective. In this session, I'd like to discuss and introduce the interaction from the political and social perspective. And the moderator said that DNG is a kind of giving a vacuum of power. So I'd like to touch upon that as well. Let's take a look at the map. The dark red represents the demarcation line, and the both areas divided by the line is DNG and its adjacent areas. The DNG and DNG adjacent areas have been managed according to the following categorization, and there is just something called the civilian control line. The civilian control line covers an area that did not give an access to civilians. And access of civilians to the civilian control line is controlled by the military. And the Military-Based Protection Act is the governing law here. And the highest level of protection is provided for the areas divided by the civilian control line. And let's take a look at the border areas that is located southern part of the civilian control line. Border area is the normal term we are using in Korea when we refer to borderland. And in Korea, we have a special law that governs the borderland, and we are using this term border areas. And border areas are the areas that have not been developed fully due to the division of the two Koreas. And these areas were designated, and they are receiving special treatment and preferences. According to administration, the border areas cover Gangwon Province and Incheon Metropolitan City, and it also covers a total of 15 cities. And borderland. This is the definition of the border areas in Korea, and the Korean government has introduced a wide range of support programs to give its full support for the border areas. Let's say you want to build a company or build a factory there, you will be able to receive tax benefits, and if you want to build or construct infrastructure, you will also, in this area, you will also receive preference. And if you want to build a social welfare center, you will also receive preferences and subsidies from the government. So the Border Area Special Act on Border Area Support provides a lot of benefits. But against its intention of the law has not been utilized to its full potential. These areas are the areas that receive the benefits of the special law, but again, the Military-Based Protection Act is also governing these areas, and the Military-Based Protection Act is overriding the Special Act on support for the border areas. So this is one of the challenges we have to fix in order to more actively utilize and take the most out of the Special Act on support for the border areas. And the tensions between the two Koreas needs to be eased in order for the preferences of the benefits from the special law to be fully utilized. In the 2000, the international community gave more attention to the ecological value of the ENG, so there has been called for designating the ENG as adjacent areas as UNESCO's World Heritage, and the South Korean government has made a lot of proposals to, for example, to build an international peace park in the DMZ area. In 2019, President Moon Jae-in also proposed to turn the DMZ into an international zone of peace. As you can see on the left-hand side, the Moon Jae-in administration announced a new policy for the Korean Peninsula and designated 3 areas as economic belts. But unfortunately, these ideas have been largely affected and influenced by the inter-Korean relations and international political situations. And as we heard a lot about the current situation or places like DNG in the previous sessions, we have to think about whether we can consider a place like DNG as a place with a natural right. Can we deem DMZ and its adjacent area as a place that holds a right to its natural resources? To develop the borderlands or border areas, these are the considerations. As I said earlier, we have to take a closer look at the interpretation of the Korean Armistice Agreement. That there are some controversies over the interpretation. The Korean government, the South Korean government, is not the direct signatory of the Korean Armistice Agreement. And the UN commander is one of the signatories, so it is the authority that gives the authority or authorization if anyone wants to have access to the area. So under this structure, it is very doubtful whether South Korea should be considered as a signatory of the agreement, because North Korea is denying that South Korea is the signatory or the direct party of the Korean Armistice Agreement. That's one of the key controversial points. Again, technically, South Korea is not the direct signatory of the Korean Armistice Agreement. Depending on whether the South Korea is a direct signatory of the Korean Armistice Agreement, things will be varied. And they will also have an impact on how we will build peace over the Korean Peninsula. And so this is a very important issue. On the other hand, we have this long period of armistice or ceasefire. So the functionality of the DMZ has been seized, or the functionality, to be specific, the functionality of the Korean Armistice Agreement has ceased. The armistice system was created in the first place to cease the war over the Korean Peninsula, and so without an agreed document, the effects of the Korean Armistice Agreement will not be seized. Even if, from a legal perspective, the interpretation can be vary, still we have to follow the current interpretation of the Korean Armistice Agreement. There has been active interaction between the two Koreas, and there have been a lot of peaceful activities between North and South Koreas. But the authority of the UN commander has given an authority of the access to the DMZ when there is a special purpose, but it has been also it caused also a controversy among people. So there has been some cases that the UN commander gave a special entry into the DMZ and its adjacent area on only on certain circumstances. But South Korean laws and regulations excluded its application to the DMZ and its adjacent areas. The next slide shows what is slightly off the point, but we also need to consider what additional perspectives we need to have. Two Koreas have had joint research on tourism by using the DNG. But if the two Koreas want to build a tourism zone in the DMZ, joint research is required and it is necessary. And I would like to touch upon this, but for the interest of time, I'll be very brief here. In this slide, you can see that when we designate a free zone for tourism, there are these considerations. And I listed up the considerations. And the priority should be placed on enforcing power when the two Koreas want to build a free zone for tourism. And the tensions between the two Koreas should be eased. And depending on the degree of the easing tensions, the degree of establishing the free zone for tourism will vary. As we experienced with the Kaesong Industrial Complex, a specific law and regulations should be enacted. And another option is a three-way communication and negotiation to decide who's going to govern the DMZ's free zone for tourism. In order to build a free zone for tourism, free entry should be guaranteed. Two Koreas have different laws and regulations to govern to give free entry. But there is a certain act called Inter-Korean Entry Act. North Korea doesn't have a specific laws and regulations to cover the free entry to the zone. But if we actualize the free zone for tourism, we can use the South Korea's laws governing tourism zone. And there are other points that can cause some controversy and that can be thought for discussion. And visitors' permit issued by North Korea contains a certain provision, but that doesn't guarantee legal protection. So this also requires a consensus and an agreement from the South Korean government. And it also has implications regarding the criminal laws, as we saw in the case with the case of Kaesong Industrial Complex. There was no way for North Korea to give up its right to execute its criminal law. The ideal situation is that the two Koreas apply their own laws by limiting the zones, the parts of the zone where the two Koreas' laws can be applied. And we also may have to guarantee property preservation and transfer guarantees of investors and business operators. And we also have to guarantee free communication and a way to resolve disputes rationally if the two Koreas want to build a free zone for tourism. That's all I have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Young-Julie. I'm sorry that I was not able to give you enough time.
No problem.
So our next speaker is Mr. Jong-Woo Han, who is the director of Gangwon Center for Creative Economy and Innovation. I'm sorry, Mr. Han, with my mismanagement of time, so you have quite a limited time, so you are the victim of my mismanaging the time. So floor is yours.
Hello, I will make it quick as much as I can. I will share my screen. Hello, I am Han Jong-ho from Gangwon Center for Creative Economy and Innovation. It was created to support young entrepreneurs based on local resources, and I work on attracting and nurture entrepreneurs and build sustainable bases. So let me tell you what we do in this center. Gangwon-do is known by Korean people as a province of high mountains, fields, deep oceans, lakes, and potatoes. There's not much to highlight as an industrial base. Gangwon-do takes up 1/6 of the total area of South Korea, but population-wise, it only accounts for 3%. Over 82% of the area is mountains, and even other areas are bound by diverse regulations. So over 90% of business owners are small-scale. Not surprisingly, Gangwon-do usually ranks in the bottom in diverse industrial index. To narrow it down to borderlands, there are 5 counties of Cheollwon, Hwacheon, Yanggu, Inje, and Gosong, with a population of 150,000. The share of manufacturing in these counties is just 2.4% of GRDP. On the other hand, public and defense economic activities take up over 52%. Which is a huge contrast to Gyeonggi borderlands, whose share of manufacturing is 42.8%. One big reason is that borderlands in Gangwon-do is designated as military facility protection zone, so civilian economic activities are not allowed, and so there's no base for economic development, and the population is steadily decreasing. Young generations and working age population are leaving, and economic slowdown continues, and commercial operations are leaving the province, posing a crisis that the entire borderlands may fade away as a community. And we are now having another crisis. The Ministry of Defense is now scaling down military forces located in borderlands under the plan called Military Reform 2.0. By 2026, they plan to dismantle 3 infantry divisions, relocate 2 infantry divisions, and merging 2 corps into 1. The economy of borderlands is likely to be hit hard, and the government and Gangwon-do have worked to vitalize borderlands in many ways. However, most of the efforts were very incomplete as they hinged on a precondition that inter-Korean exchanges would be active. They enacted a special act, but there's no specific plan for funding. So, and the area was designated as biosphere reserves, and a plan was proposed to transform it into ecological peace zone, but nothing has really changed. So let me share with you 3 perspectives that we see these challenges. For the job seekers' perspective, they don't have jobs and they leave. For the companies, they cannot have many talented resources here, so they leave as well. From the market perspective, the population goes down, there's no companies working here, so the demand will go down, and it makes them harder to do any business. To break this vicious circle, we have to attract young generations back. If we can offer jobs for the young, we should offer something like business conditions where they can do what they want to do in local regions. If we can provide these opportunities to the young generations in the borderlands, more and more young people will come back to their hometown or move from other regions. And when local governments can put this supportive program in place to help them settle and start their business, we can build a bigger momentum. Our main target will be the young millennials. Unlike the parent generation who sought industrialization and economic growth, they value personal preferences and experiences and seek unique lifestyles. And more millennials are now leaving large cities to create startups in local areas. So they were born after 1980s, and they already take up 25% of South Korea's population today, as they prefer loosely knit relationship with those who share similar preferences, and they build different community-based businesses. They like handmade craft works and also local food. And they also want to have like a shared economy, and they are very active in this shared economy services. When you look at these entrepreneurs, there are two different types. U-turn, which means that they will leave for large cities and come back to their local areas, and I-turn and J-turn. So there are different patterns of how these young millennials are coming back to their local cities. This is not just unique to Korea. In Japan, like since 10 years ago, we are having this U-turn, J-turn, or I-turn type of millennials who are settling in local areas and learning startups and grow their economy. Of course, it was not that they come back overnight. At first, they come to local areas as a tourist, and they come back again and again as they like the city, or they often buy local agriculture produces or live in the city for a short period of time just for an experience. And then at some point, they come to like the city enough to be a part of it and work together with the local residents. The center, since 2015, has identified and supported young entrepreneurs who settle in 18 cities and counties of Gangwon-do. They combine unique local resources with their own unique and creative content to provide very special products or services. In Korea, we have a name for them, local creators. The Korean government set aside a special fund of almost 10 billion won starting this year to support local creators worldwide. The center has identified and supported 200 local creators since 2015. In different forms of providing financial support for commercialization, connecting them with mentors, or carrying out design update projects. What you see on the map or on the slide is the list of the entrepreneurs in Gangwon-do. The center and local governments tend to set their own targets in advance, and they think that spending money will solve the problems. However, without engaging the people who will settle in the region and keep their life rooted in local regions, in other words, the human capital, you cannot make it work. To attract the people, you should offer the opportunities for them to do what they want to do. When you build the right environment for them, then more and more millennials will come to your city with diverse business ideas. And when they compete and cooperate with peers along the way, the local community will see an entrepreneur ecosystem prosper. So if we celebrate the diversity of startups and are open and embrace entrepreneurs from outside, even Borderlands will be able to renew itself as a new community. Thank you. I have a lot to say, but I'm sorry, due to time constraints, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Han. Sorry about this timing issue. All the speakers, we have received a number of questions. Here you can see in Q&A box, you will see 6 and then 7 questions. So could you look at? So we have about 10 minutes. So let me invite you, so each of you to pick one question and respond to the question in 1 minute or not more than 90 seconds. So perhaps can I start with Professor Hammond? So you have a question. You mentioned the 4 resources. It seems 3. So how can you?
Sorry, I just for some reason I can't see the Q&A anymore. I could see it before. Can you read me the question? Sorry.
So you mentioned the 4 resources, and then so let me just make a brief. How can you turn and use those resources in a positive manner toward prosperity.
Wait, I'm not hearing you. Hang on. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned the poor resources. Yeah. So the question is how to utilize, how to turn them for prosperity.
How to turn which resources?
You mentioned the four resources.
Oh, the four resources. Yeah, sorry.
So
okay.
how can you use them for
yeah, you're right. I mean,
manner?
Of course they can be used in a variety of ways. It's not a resource is not always something that can be used for peace building or for for prosperity. They can be turned around and used in other ways as well. But the point, I guess, in highlighting them is to in highlighting them, then you become more deliberate in your way of thinking about how actually to turn them into positive sources, positive resources. So, I mean, it is true clearly that people fight over identity, for instance. But if we focus on the commonalities that bring people together in these border regions and the central role that shared identities may have, then that may be the seeds of a peace building or a conflict resolution kind of initiative. That is not, my interest is in using what's there on the border and what's already binding people together rather than trying to sort of introduce something from outside. So it's really just about, of course, resources are neutral. You can do with them what you like. You can go and fight with each other. You can make peace with each other. So it's just about shining a light onto that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions are not addressed to specific speaker, but you can just choose one and respond.
제가 6번에 대한
I will answer the question number 6. I think the person designated me to answer the question. How the solidarity serves, I think that's the question. In terms of the social economy in a local area, they can do many things. What the local or the central government can do in terms of the public services. They can support the disadvantaged people. But there's one thing that comes up in Korea. In addressing the social issues, they can also seek growth and development as a company. So we have a term like social venture. So we are seeing more and more of the social venture companies. These social venture companies, and they also get this investment with this social venture capital, and this venture capital is growing very fast. And in Korea, the government also makes their investment and funding for these venture capital companies. And also in each region of Korea, the local governments may not be able to handle all the issues, and these companies can also help providing the social goods, and they also seek their own social or public profits, and they are growing very fast. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Han. Let me also invite others.
I can go with the question 3.
Okay, please.
So the question is, could you hear me well? Okay, so what is a suitable relation between the development and the environment? So thank you, Meisara, for this answer. For this question, my answer is quite so. As we can see from also the presentation we had this morning, it's difficult to state and to formalize, in my opinion, suitable relation between development and environment, because we know that over the last 20 years, international development and in general international policies have promoted the concept of sustainable development as a guideline at the global scale, and this was fine like 20 years ago, in my opinion. But now, over the last years, we realize that maybe these global guidelines are weak and cannot work for all the complexity and the heterogeneous context we have in Borderlands. And therefore, we have like to critically question and ask ourselves that we can find different and local relation between development and environment that can work and can be organized and formalized by the states and the communities who live and experience the everyday complexity of these borderlands. And so in my opinion, we have like to foster this idea and this political perspective of promoting different way and different relation between development and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It also responds to both question and two and three. Can I invite Professor Nugent to respond to question 1? Any successful development efforts in borderland region? Would it be possible for you to speak about this?
I mean, I think maybe Laura is better placed to answer that, because I think she gave us some examples where things had happened. The examples I was giving were actually ones where there was some very positive things happening up until maybe 5 to 7 years ago, but since then it's kind of stalled and it hasn't gone much further. I think maybe my answer might be better to the last question from Augustine.
Yeah, please.
Talking about the Alaskan example, because I'm dealing with a not entirely comparable case, but it's a case where the capital city of Togo, Lomé, is on the border, and on the other side of the border is Aplau, the Ghanaian border town. And those two settlements are completely interrelated. So people live in Ghana, they commute across the border to Togo, and they come home at night. People send children to the school on the other side. This was all happening until COVID, and then suddenly, bam, the border is closed. And this has had a tremendously detrimental impact on inside traders, all kinds of people who use that border on an everyday basis. There was no planning for this contingency, and I'm skeptical that people will be learning lessons from it in quite that way. But what has happened is that people have found ways of getting around it. So in practice, people are able to get through the border. They don't go through the main crossing point, but they find these other alternative routes. But then they have to pay. They have to pay significant sums of money. So it's created a kind of rentier economy around that border area, which is simply compounds many of the detrimental social effects. I hope you could hear me there.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, we have to conclude this session. Thank you very much for your contribution, participation in this session. So I mean, each borders have a different level of openness and different level of interactions. So some interactions across border can happen in negative way, or many cases also in positive way. There are different concepts you have presented with regard to cross-border economic, especially economic integration, with the economic corridors or geo-economy and different concepts. And also the discussion about this political ecology, how to govern the resources in the borderland. So this meeting is organized by Gangwon province and Choron, as I told you earlier. Both sides, especially south side, wishes to have a opportunity to increase the level of interaction, to actually not increase it because there is no interaction yet. So really build opportunities, platforms for cross-border interaction and integration with the North. So the experiences from Africa and Central Asia and other parts of the world can be good reference for the Korean Peninsula, even if the political context and geographical context are very different. With that, let me conclude the session. Let me extend my appreciation to speakers and also viewers watching this early morning or late evening or the afternoon. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I can tell there is a lot to be said on this topic, and 2 hours is never quite enough. I hope there are more opportunities in the future for such discussions. In particular, I would like to thank Sang-Min Nam for moderating the session and also the 6 presenters for the valuable input. We'll now move on to session number 6. That will be in about an hour and a half, which is 9 o'clock Korean time and 12 Greenwich Mean Time. And the topic will be interventions by the UN. We'll be joined by 7 United experts, and the session will begin at 9 o'clock Korean time. We look forward to seeing you then.